Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about two very closely related muscle groups that I see very commonly neglected out there, and I think it's largely due to sometimes too much focus on minimalism. And what I mean by that is people who think that they can just do conventional deadlifts as the only posterior chain exercises and that that's going to be enough. And I'm not going to say I haven't written some very short-term programs for that, but I think people forget that even my Ice Cream Fitness 2.0, I recommended it for relatively short periods of time. I don't recommend people run it for a year. And one of the things I've added is that if someone wanted to try to run it for any length of time beyond building a base, they'd need to add a bunch of posterior chain work. But the muscle groups that we really see neglected tend to be things like the hamstrings and the low back. And of course, throughout this video, you guys will watch me do two of my favorite posterior chain builders. And as you guys can see, even though I'm a strength athlete and I really care about 1-rep maxes and singles more than anything, I do all of these for fairly high reps. Right? I do these for very high reps. And a lot of times I used to do the good mornings with 20 rep sets. I do them with 10s now because I'm focused more on tension and because I've got a reverse hyper to handle the volume. But if you guys look there, I think on this one I've got 370 pounds on there. I'm doing sets of 25 with that. It's very high rep, right? Very high rep. But the point is, both of these exercises, irrespective of even what bar you use, still have a very heavy focus on the hamstrings and on the low back. And these would be very good movements to build those things up. In other words, if you have access to both of these things, I'd say you're in a pretty good position as far as that goes, as far as preventing injuries, as far as building your strength. But again, we see many people who do things like deadlifts and then complain that their low back hurts. Okay, or we get hamstring pulls. And we've seen that even with me, right? When I went through a period of time where I was doing quite a bit of minimalism, I had a lot of stuff going on in my life that kind of dictated it, and I'm not going to get into all that here, but they weren't normal problems that most of you deal with. Okay, it related to me being a reasonably famous YouTuber that interfered with certain aspects of my life and then other things that carried over from it in my personal life. I did do some minimalist training for a while. Well, the result of that was I pulled hamstrings fairly easily when I started doing work with over 500 pounds on the deadlift. And we did have an example. You guys saw me put up the whole back of my leg kind of turning black, which is a hamstring pull, which is a minor tear. That's a minor injury. I mean, I was able to continue to train and pull heavy a week later, but its pull still happens. So guys who are getting those issues, guys who talk about their low back hurting or cramping or fatigued while doing something like a deadlift, yeah, it's because you have a weak low back. You haven't built work capacity in it. And again, I think there's a misconception there when it comes to your spinal erectors, is that they're this major, massive primary mover always on the deadlift. Well, the EMG data kind of says that they're not. They're used heavily, but they're not really the primary mover. And it's not like they can move very large amounts of weight on their own. They take a larger stabilizing role than most people realize in a deadlift. But if they're weak, you won't be able to stay tight, and you'll probably get more back rounding than you want, and you can experience some pain and some discomfort and some pulling. So it would behoove you to build these things up, which also kind of comes over to the other point. Wait, if the deadlift is what you're doing for your low back, and the deadlift doesn't particularly work the low back that effectively, then your low back is being neglected. You need to be doing other stuff for it. Okay, we need to be doing other stuff for our low back. And again, a big issue I generally see is lack of work capacity. So for a lot of people out there, spending some time doing very high rep good mornings will resolve both of those issues to a very large degree. Now, I wish everyone had access to a reverse hyper. You know, in a perfect world, a lot of these issues could be resolved by someone just getting on a reverse hyper almost every day, like what you see me doing here. Right? In a perfect world, this is what you would do. In a perfect world, everyone would have one in their home. Everyone would have one at their gym. Right? I think that would be phenomenal, but that's not the case. High rep good mornings can go a long way. And why do we need to build that work capacity in the low back? What is so special about doing the really high rep stuff for it? Well, you have to factor in that the erectors, that whole area, if you look at it, it's not really that much muscle there. If you diet down lean and lose all your body fat, none of you guys are going to have a thick low back. Even if you've hypertrophied it massively, there's not a lot of muscle in that area. It's mostly connective tissue. It's a lot of connective tissue. That means tendons. Well, tendons are notorious for having lack of blood flow to them in many cases. They're notorious for slow recovery. And so when you hear people say things like the low back recovers very, very slowly, you'll hear that said oftentimes. But we shouldn't just accept that at face value. You need to ask why. Why does it recover slowly? Well, you'll hear people say that tendons recover more slowly than muscles do in many cases. That's true. Muscles can recover faster than tendons from training. Well, what's the low back made mostly of? There's far more tendon down there than there is muscle tissue. Unlike most of the other muscle groups in your body, it's largely connective tissue. So therefore, it has issues with blood flow. It has issues with needing enough capillaries and everything around it. Well, doing all this really higher volume training for that area can help build capillary beds and other stuff all through there. It can help increase your work capacity through that area and recovery. Okay, that's really important to do, and I think everyone needs a phase of doing that in their training. It'd be a very wise idea. Okay. Incidentally, most of the exercises that do work the low back do work the hamstrings pretty well also. It's one of the other big issues we have with hamstrings is lack of mobility. Lack of strength, lack of range of motion, and lack of mobility. Well, what's our difference? Strength, most people get. It's the ability to produce force, right? How much force can that muscle produce? That's strength. It's very straightforward. Range of motion is how far can you move it under your own movement without forcing it, right? Not when you reach up and stretch it. How far can you just move it with your own body? Mobility is how strong are you at the ends of the range of motion, right? Mobility is about the strength curve itself. How far can you stretch it, and how strong are you from those stretch positions in a muscle? Like how much force can you produce from those positions? Okay, mobility is a strength component. It's not a flexibility thing. Because whatever your flexibility is in your range of motion, that's what it is. The mobility is just how strong are you from those positions. And we see mobility issues big time in hamstrings, especially for people with sedentary lives, people who drive for a living or sit in a desk for a living, who are not on their feet all day with their job. Okay? Which is the normal human condition. We're bipedal for a reason. Humans are bipedal, and historically we tended to, for most of human evolutionary history, we were on our feet most of the day. We weren't sitting. Okay? This creates problems with our hamstrings. And so you need to be doing a lot of stuff that puts the hamstrings into stretched positions. Otherwise, people just tend towards having very tight hamstrings with piss poor mobility, bad range of motion, which of course also makes them weak as well. But let's talk about strengthening them. Well, how do we get hypertrophy? Well, it's usually the stretch lengthening cycle is a factor. So all these stretch position movements for a muscle that tends to get tight and lose range of motion due to our lifestyles, well, we can create a phenomenal difference there. And if we don't do that, we're predisposing ourselves to injuries doing other stuff. In other words, if you sit all day and you don't do all this work to build those hamstrings up, how often do you pull your back when doing other stuff? How often do you pull a hamstring? Okay. Not only when doing a deadlift, but how about if running, if jumping, playing a game of basketball, right? A lot of you guys out there who haven't developed these and you don't have hamstring mobility and strength and range of motion, you're going to go play a game of basketball with your friends out of the blue. You might get away with that in your 20s. Wait till you're 30 and you try that. Wait till you're 35 and you haven't built that area up and you go doing a bunch of running and jumping. Well, don't be surprised if you get injured. Be surprised if you get injured, all right? Because you're out of shape. And I'll say that's definitely a component of being out of shape. Mobility is part of being in shape. Strength is part of being in shape. If your hamstrings are tight and weak, you are out of shape. I don't care what other metrics you have for determining it. You're not in shape, and you will get hurt easily. You're not a fit individual. All right, guys, so that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.